Jack Anderson had always prided himself on his precision, his ability to navigate life's complexities with the sharp focus of a man who had long mastered the art of control. A corporate executive by trade, he was accustomed to handling high-stakes deals, managing multi-million-dollar mergers, and crafting solutions to every problem that arose. But in the span of a single tragic evening, that mastery was ripped away from him like a carefully curated facade, leaving only the raw, unfamiliar undercurrent of confusion. The accident had been swift, too quick for him to comprehend what was happening. A swerve of the wheel, a blinding flash of headlights, and then the deafening crash. Afterward, everything had gone dark, and when Jack awoke, it was to a world that felt eerily disconnected. A world where his reflection felt like that of a stranger, his body foreign and unresponsive. The sterile white walls of the hospital room offered no comfort, no familiarity. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to mock his sense of time, reminding him that everything he once knew had slipped through his fingers, gone with the wind, leaving behind nothing but silence and questions. The hum of machines around him was the only sound that anchored him to reality, their rhythmic beeping, the steady pulse of a life he couldn't fully claim. A soft voice broke through the haze, a voice that carried with it a mixture of warmth and sorrow. Jack, the voice whispered like a secret shared in the quiet of the night. He blinked slowly, his eyes adjusting to the dim lighting as his gaze shifted to the figure at his side. She was standing there, a silhouette bathed in the soft glow of the overhead light, her face etched with concern. But something about her felt wrong, too familiar, and yet too distant. "Jack, darling," she repeated, her voice breaking the silence once more, trembling at the edges with emotion. "It's me, Maya." Maya. The name sounded like a dream he couldn't quite grasp, something just out of reach. He looked at her, really looked at her, and found himself caught in the depths of her eyes. Dark, almond-shaped eyes that shimmered with unshed tears. Her skin, a smooth, rich caramel, glowed in the faint hospital light. She was beautiful, yes, but there was something else in her expression, something that made his chest tighten, something like recognition, but so faint, so fragile that it slipped away the moment he tried to hold on to it. "Maya," he murmured, testing the name on his lips as though the very utterance might unlock some hidden chamber within his mind. But the response was nothing more than a hollow echo. She smiled, a sad, bittersweet curve of her lips, as if she could hear the disappointment in his voice, as if she understood the depth of the emptiness that echoed within him. "You don't remember me, do you?" He shook his head slowly, the weight of that realization settling heavily upon him. "I don't know," he whispered almost to himself. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, like a man waking up from a long, restless sleep. Maya's breath caught a silent sob that seemed to escape her throat unbidden. "It's okay, Jack. It's okay," she said softly, her hand brushing the back of his. "I'll help you remember. We'll take this one step at a time." He studied her, his mind scrambling for some fragment of recognition, some recollection of who this woman was, of why she felt so important to him. But the harder he searched, the further she seemed to drift. There was a gnawing feeling deep inside him, a longing to reach her, to understand her, to pull the memories back into place. But they refused to return. The floodgates were locked tight, and he was drowning in the vast, silent expanse of his mind. "Jack," she continued, her voice softer now. "You were in a car accident. I—" She stopped herself, taking a shaky breath. "I'm your wife, Maya Anderson, and this is our daughter Zoe." The words hit him like a blow, even though they were simply stated. His wife? Did he have a wife? A daughter? Maya held up a small picture frame, gently placing it in his hands. Jack stared at it, at the young girl smiling up at him from the photo. Zoe. She had his eyes wide and curious, and yet there was an unmistakable softness to her smile that pulled at something deep within him, something he couldn't quite name. "I don't know who I am anymore," Jack confessed, his voice cracking slightly as he held the photo. "You're Jack Anderson, the man who promised me forever," she whispered, her voice barely audible, now filled with the weight of an unspoken grief. You're my partner, the father of our child. You're the man I've been waiting for." The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing against him as he struggled to make sense of it all. The disorientation was overwhelming, and for a moment he simply couldn't breathe. Who was he now? What was left of the man he once was? "I don't know how to do this," Jack admitted, the rawness of his vulnerability finally spilling out. "I don't know how to be the man you need." Maya squeezed his hand, her touch gentle but firm. "You don't have to remember everything all at once, Jack," she said softly. "We'll take this slow together. Every day is a new chance." For the first time since his eyes had opened to this strange new world, Jack felt a flicker of hope, a fragile, tentative spark that whispered, maybe. Maybe it's possible. As Maya's hand rested against his, her warmth a reminder of the life they had once shared, Jack felt a stirring inside him, a distant echo of something more. And though he could not yet recall the fullness of their love, he knew that there was a story here, a story he was desperate to rediscover. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, but one thing was clear: he was no longer alone. Maya was here, and for reasons beyond his understanding, she believed in him. If you feel the pull of this story, this journey of rediscovery, love and healing, please give us a like, comment, or follow. Your support helps us tell stories that connect us all, that remind us of the power of second chances and the beauty of memory even when it's broken. Stay with us, for there's so much more to discover. Maya Anderson sat in the quiet, sterile waiting room, the soft hum of fluorescent lights above her, filling the emptiness between her thoughts. The scent of antiseptic lingered in the air, the faintest trace of bleach and hospital linen, so familiar, so foreign. She had come here every day for 6 months, sitting in the same hard plastic chairs, feeling like a shadow in the halls of a life that no longer felt her own. The waiting was a constant and endless refrain that echoed through her soul, as if she were stuck in some eternal pause, waiting for something she couldn't even name. Her heart had been broken before, but this was something different. This was not the death of a love, but the slow, unrelenting disappearance of it. Jack, the man she had once known, the man she had promised her soul to, was no longer the man she loved. And in his place she had been given someone new, someone who wore his face but whose eyes were empty, whose heart was a blank canvas wiped clean of all the history they had shared. She closed her eyes and leaned her head back, allowing herself a moment of rest, a moment to forget the tears that had threatened to spill for so long. Her mind wandered to the days before the accident, before the world had come crashing down around them. Jack had been her everything. They had been partners, best friends, lovers, two halves of a whole. Their love had been effortless, woven into the very fabric of their lives, a tapestry rich with joy, laughter, and quiet understanding. But now, as she sat here alone with her thoughts, that tapestry felt like a distant dream, something that belonged to another time, another life. Jack had lost everything: his memories, his identity, his connection to her. And though he wore the same face, though he held her hand with the same gentleness, there was a gulf between them that stretched wider with each passing day. The doctors had told her that this kind of trauma was common in amnesia following a severe brain injury. They assured her that with time, Jack's memories might return, that the man she had once known would eventually come back to her. But Maya wasn't so sure. The Jack who had woken up in that sterile hospital bed was a stranger. His eyes haunted his mind, adrift in a fog of confusion. And though he would sometimes speak her name, sometimes reach for her hand, as if trying to recall something, it was always fleeting, like the soft echo of a whisper lost in the wind. She glanced at the clock, noting the time with a quiet resignation. Another hour had passed, another day in the long line of days that had come before it. Maya had become accustomed to this rhythm, the steady passage of time, the slow, painful unfolding of each moment. Every day she arrived here, and every day she left feeling more and more distant from the man she once called her husband. She knew this journey wasn't just about Jack regaining his memory. It was about her finding a way to live without the man she had lost, without the man she was desperate to bring back. There were days when the weight of the loneliness threatened to crush her. She was raising their daughter Zoe on her own now, a task that, though filled with love, had become infinitely harder without Jack by her side. She had become both mother and father, protector and nurturer. And while her love for Zoe was boundless, there was an aching part of her that longed for the presence of the man she had built her life, with the man who was supposed to be there beside her, sharing in the joy and the burden of parenthood. But Jack had been stolen from her, and every day she learned to carry the weight of their shared dream alone. Maya sighed and stood stretching the tension from her back. She looked down at her watch, noting the time with a quiet sense of determination. It was time to go in. She had made this choice long ago to stay to fight for Jack, even when he could no longer remember why he should fight for her. The doctors said it might take months. They said he might never fully remember their life together. But Maya didn't care. She would wait. She would wait for as long as it took. Her fingers brushed against the door handle, and with a soft exhale, she stepped into the room. Jack was sitting up in the bed, his eyes glazed with a faraway look, the steady beep of the heart monitor the only sound between them. He looked up when he saw her, his gaze hesitant, almost searching, as if he were trying to place her in some forgotten corner of his mind. Maya, he said softly, his voice raw, with something she couldn't quite name. It's you. It's me, she replied, her heart twisting in her chest. She walked over to his bedside, her steps slow measured. I'm here, Jack. I'm always here. He smiled a tentative, fragile smile. I wish I could remember more. I wish I could remember us. Maya reached out and took his hand, her fingers trembling as they closed around his. She could feel the warmth of his skin beneath her touch, and for a moment it felt like everything was right. She didn't need him to remember all the years they had together. She didn't need him to recall their first kiss or their wedding day. All she needed was for him to know that she was here, that she was still waiting for him, no matter how long it took. We'll make new memories, she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. We'll build a new life, Jack, one step at a time. He looked up at her, his eyes searching her face with a look of vulnerability that pierced her heart. I don't want to disappoint you, he whispered. You could never disappoint me, Maya whispered back, her voice trembling. Not now, not ever. Tears welled up in her eyes as she leaned down and kissed his forehead gently. This was all she could give him, her love, her unwavering presence. It wasn't enough, and yet in some way it was everything. She wasn't sure how long it would take for him to remember, or if he ever would. But she knew one thing for certain: she would wait for him. She would wait even if it took a lifetime. And as she sat beside him holding his hand, Maya realized that love wasn't just about memories. It wasn't about holding on to the past. Love was about the present, the quiet moments, the small gestures, the tenderness that existed in the here and now. She had no idea what the future held, but she knew that this was the beginning of something new, something just as beautiful, just as meaningful as the life they had once shared. And in that moment, as the soft glow of the setting sun filtered through the window, Maya Anderson whispered a promise to herself, a promise to the man she loved, even if he couldn't remember her. Yet I'll be here. I'll always be here. The rain had been falling softly all day, a constant patter against the windows of the small cafe where Maya had retreated to find solace in the warmth of her tea. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind that felt like a gentle lull in the storm that seemed to rage within her heart. With the hustle of work behind her and Zoe safely with her neighbor for the afternoon, Maya took a moment to breathe, to rest, to think. Yet even in this peaceful solitude, a sense of longing gnawed at her, a hunger that had been with her for months, an ache for a man who no longer remembered the love they had once shared. She stirred her tea absently, her eyes gazing out at the rain-soaked streets, watching as the world moved in its usual rhythm, unaware of the inner turmoil she carried like a weight. The life she once knew had crumbled, and in its place was a fragile, uncertain future, held together by the threads of hope that she clung to desperately. The hope that Jack would remember her, the hope that someday they would rebuild what had been broken. her fingers wrapped tightly around the warm mug, as if its heat could provide some comfort against the coldness that had seeped into her life. She had been patient. She had waited sometimes in agony, sometimes in silent resolve. But even she knew there was a limit to how much she could endure. The door to the cafe opened with a soft chime, and Maya barely glanced up, lost in the weight of her own thoughts. A man entered, his coat soaked from the rain, his hair darkened and sticking to his forehead. He looked like someone who had been caught in the downpour, someone who had not expected to be here, but found himself seeking shelter nonetheless. He shook off his umbrella, the water splattering on the floor, before he folded it with a practiced hand. Maya's eyes lifted, drawn to him by some instinct she couldn't explain. There was something about the way he moved, something familiar in his quiet grace. He wasn't a man who demanded attention, but rather he exuded a quiet confidence that made others take notice. His face was unremarkable in the way of many faces, yet his presence stirred something deep inside her, something she had been trying to ignore for far too long. He caught her gaze across the room, and for a split second their eyes locked, a brief but intense connection that sent a strange shiver through Maya. She looked away quickly, uncomfortable with the sensation, yet there was something undeniable about it, something that made her pulse quicken and her breath catch in her throat. She had felt this feeling before, this inexplicable pull towards someone she didn't know. It had been so long since she had felt anything at all, so long since Jack had walked into her life with that same kind of certainty, a certainty she had lost in his absence. He took a seat at the counter, ordering a black coffee, his voice low and warm, as though every word he spoke was carefully considered. Maya tried to ignore the sudden flutter in her chest, the way her heart seemed to skip a beat as she watched him from the corner of her eye. She couldn't deny the feeling that there was something pulling her toward him, something that whispered this wasn't just an ordinary encounter, not by any means. For a moment the cafe felt quieter, the usual clinking of cups and the murmur of conversation fading into the background. The only sound was the soft ticking of the clock on the wall and the rhythmic beat of her heart. Maya could feel her pulse in her throat, the tension building as she tried to focus on her tea, on the simple act of breathing. But her mind kept returning to him, the man who seemed to be out of place here, just as she often felt out of place in her own life. His coffee arrived and he took a sip, his eyes lingering on the street outside, as though he too was lost in his thoughts. Maya found herself wondering for no reason at all what had brought him here on such a dreary day. He didn't seem like the kind of man who frequented places like this. His clothes were simple but well-tailored, his shoes polished to a shine. He had the look of someone who moved in higher circles, someone whose life was just as precise and well-ordered as the movements of his hands. Without thinking, Maya found herself rising from her seat, the motion as fluid as it was unfamiliar. She stepped toward the counter, her heart pounding as she walked past him, feeling the magnetic pull between them growing stronger with every step. He looked up when she approached, his gaze meeting hers with a faint smile, the kind of smile that suggested a quiet understanding, a wordless acknowledgement that neither of them could fully explain. The warmth in his eyes caught her off guard, and for a brief moment, Maya felt herself caught in the orbit of his gaze, unable to look away. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "Is this seat taken?" He glanced at the chair beside him, his expression thoughtful. "Not at all," he replied, his voice like warm honey, smooth and inviting. "Please." Maya hesitated for a moment before sitting down, her body instinctively moving closer to his, as if guided by some unseen force. The air between them seemed charged electric in a way she couldn't quite place. There was no reason for her to feel this way. She had a life, a history. She had Jack. She was waiting for Jack to come back to her. Yet sitting here in this moment with this man, everything felt suddenly uncertain. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude." Maya said, her words soft, almost apologetic. I needed a moment." The man studied her for a second, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he were searching for something in her expression. He seemed to be reading her in a way that unsettled her, as though he could see the parts of her she kept hidden. He nodded slowly, as though understanding exactly what she meant. "You're not intruding," he said, his voice soft but steady. Sometimes we all need a little escape, a moment to breathe. Maya smiled, though it felt like a gesture of survival rather than genuine warmth. The truth was she hadn't expected to be speaking to him at all, and now in this strange moment, the world around her seemed to slow her focus, narrowing to him alone. I'm Maya, she said, extending her hand, her palm slightly sweaty. Maya Anderson. He took her hand in his grip warm and firm, and for a moment she could have sworn she felt a spark, a quiet, undeniable connection. Something that made her heart beat just a little faster. Jackson Miller, he said simply, his eyes meeting hers again this time, with something more, something deeper. Nice to meet you, Maya. The name sent a shiver down her spine. Jackson, Jack. She blinked, her thoughts suddenly jumbled. No, it couldn't be. But the familiarity of it, the way his name lingered in the air between them, made her wonder if the universe was playing some cruel joke. She was still grieving the man she had lost, the man who wore Jack's face, and here was this stranger with a name so close to his own, pulling her in with an ease she couldn't explain. Maya tried to steady her breath to ground herself in reality. This was not Jack. This was just a man named Jackson. But there was something there. Something about him reminded her so much of what she had once had. The way he spoke, the way he carried himself, the way his presence seemed to fill the room, just like Jack's once had. The world outside continued to rain, but for a brief fleeting moment, Maya felt as though she had stepped into a new world, one where the lines between the past and present blurred, and the future seemed full of possibility. And for the first time in months, Maya allowed herself to wonder if she could learn to hope again. The rain hadn't ceased. It clung to the windows like 1,000 whispers, each droplet tracing a path of its own down the glass, leaving a trail of fleeting memories in its wake. The weather, like her heart, felt heavy, pressing down on Maya as she stood behind the counter of the small corner store, where she had worked for the past few years, serving the familiar faces that drifted in and out of the community. It was the kind of place where nothing much ever changed, where time seemed to move at a slower pace, almost as though the world outside had forgotten it. But Maya couldn't escape the weight of it all, the weight of the secret she carried, the heaviness of the truth that seemed to hang over her like an unspoken promise. Zoe's medicine had run out, and despite her best efforts to stretch what little she had, she knew she wouldn't make it to the end of the week. She had no choice. The bills had piled up, and Jack's medical expenses had drained every last ounce of her savings. She had no family to turn to, no one who would understand. Her fingers trembled as she scanned another can of baby formula, the familiar beep of the register ringing in her ears. She should have been grateful for the job, for the stability it provided in an uncertain world. But today, that gratitude was buried beneath the suffocating weight of her circumstances. She had nothing left to give, nothing but her pride, and that was slipping through her fingers, thread by thread. A sudden noise broke her thoughts, a soft shuffle of footsteps followed by the rustle of a coat. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. The woman's footsteps were soft, hesitant, like she was trying not to be noticed. The older woman, Mrs. Rodriguez, had come in just like she did every Wednesday to buy groceries for her family. Maya took a deep breath, trying to push the gnawing unease in her stomach away. Her hand lingered on the scanner as she glanced over at Mrs. Rodriguez, offering a tight smile. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Rodriguez," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. The older woman returned the smile, her eyes warm, but filled with a quiet knowing. Mrs. Rodriguez was one of the few people who had shown kindness to Maya in the past few months. She had offered words of comfort when Maya's grief had felt too heavy to bear her presence, a silent promise of solidarity. She was a mother too, and in that Maya could always find a thread of connection. "Afternoon, Maya," Mrs. Rodriguez replied, her voice thick with the accent of someone who had lived through hardship. "How's Zoe? Growing up fast, I bet." Maya's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly masked it. "She's good, getting into everything like always." She turned her attention back to the register, her fingers still nervously clutching the scanner. But as the seconds ticked by, something inside her began to stir, a subtle shift in the air, an awareness that something was amiss. She couldn't put her finger on it, but there was something about Mrs. Rodriguez's movements that felt off. Then in the quiet of the store, Maya saw it, a flash of motion by the baby formula aisle. It was swift, almost imperceptible. A woman, young, thin, and dressed in a coat that looked worn and patched, was slipping a can of formula into the folds of her jacket. Maya's heart skipped a beat. For a moment she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, her gaze locked on the woman who was so clearly desperate. The woman didn't seem to notice her, lost in the quiet urgency of what she was doing. She glanced around, checking if anyone was watching, before slipping down the aisle. Her movements quick, practiced. Maya's mind raced, torn between the need to act and the deep empathy that swelled inside her chest. She had seen this before, the desperation in the eyes of mothers who would do anything to protect their children, even if it meant crossing a line they would never have thought possible. Maya's hands were shaking as she reached for the phone behind the counter, her fingers brushing against the smooth surface of the device. She hesitated. Her mind fought against the impulse to do the right thing, to call for help, to alert the authorities. But her heart couldn't bear it. The woman's quiet desperation mirrored her own, and Maya felt an unspoken understanding pass between them. The woman was still moving through the aisles, unaware of Maya's gaze. A can of formula was tucked under her jacket. The truth was clear now: this was no random theft. This was survival. Maya glanced over at Mrs. Rodriguez, who was still casually selecting vegetables, her back turned. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't do it. Not today. Not when her own life felt like it was unraveling, when she had given up everything just to make sure Zoe had what she needed. With trembling hands, Maya pulled the phone from the counter, but before she could make the call, the bell above the door jingled again. The man who entered was familiar, his presence quiet but commanding. Jack. He had shown up out of nowhere, as he often did these days. His appearance was an enigma, a disruption to the fragile world she had created in the wake of his absence. Jack's gaze swept across the room, his eyes searching his face, always unreadable. But when his eyes fell on Maya, they softened, and for a split second, she caught a glimpse of the man she had loved, the man she was still fighting for. Her heart gave a painful lurch, and that's when she saw his eyes. His focus narrowed on the young woman by the aisle, the one who had been stealing. Maya Jack's voice was calm, but the uncertainty in his tone made her heart skip. "Is everything okay?" Before Maya could respond, the woman at the aisle noticed him watching her. She froze, her hand instinctively clutching the can of formula closer to her chest, as though she might shield it from the world. Maya's heart ached for her. She could see the fear in the woman's eyes, the panic that gripped her. In that moment, she understood her completely. Desperation had no room for pride. Jack took a step forward, but his gaze didn't leave the woman. The room grew quiet, the tension palpable. The woman's voice trembled as she spoke, barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, I was just—" Jack moved closer, his steps deliberate. His presence in the room felt like a weight. "No need to apologize," he said softly, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I know what it's like to be pushed to the edge. We've all been there." Maya's breath caught in her throat. Was this the same man who had been so rigid, so detached from the world outside of his own suffering? He was different now, his words carrying an understanding she had never seen in him before. The woman hesitated, looking at Maya, her eyes wide with fear. She looked so young, so lost. "It's just—" The woman's voice faltered as she spoke again, her head bowing in shame. "My baby, she's sick, and I can't afford the medicine. The formula was all I had left. I swear I wasn't trying to steal. I just don't know what else to do." Maya's heart clenched. She took a step toward the woman, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's okay," she whispered. "I understand." The young woman looked up at her, confused, her eyes filled with silent questions. Maya nodded, her hand gently resting on the woman's shoulder, offering her the comfort she desperately needed. Jack stood silent for a moment, processing the situation. Finally, he spoke, his voice firm, but there was a tenderness behind it. "We'll take care of it," he said simply. "You don't have to worry about this anymore." Maya looked up at him, her heart swelling with something that was almost like relief, almost like hope. Jack had changed. There was still so much of him to rediscover, but in this moment he had proven that love could reach beyond the brokenness, that even in the midst of darkness, compassion could still find a way to shine through. And as the young woman left the can of formula in hand, Maya and Jack stood together in the quiet aftermath, their hands brushing as they shared a look, an unspoken promise that whatever came next, they would face it together. The days had begun to blur into one another, each moment tinged with the quiet uncertainty that had become Maya's life since Jack's accident. He had come a long way, and yet in some inexplicable way, he remained a stranger. She had watched him with a mixture of hope and sorrow, desperately clinging to the memory of the man she had once known, the man she had promised to love for a lifetime. But with each passing day, his memory of their shared past seemed to slip further away, leaving only flashes, fragmented pieces of a life that was no longer his to recall. Maya had been patient, more patient than she ever thought herself capable of being. She had devoted herself to caring for him, to helping him rediscover the world he had lost. But despite her best efforts, the distance between them remained. Jack, for all the tenderness he had shown, was still not the man he had been. His eyes no longer held the same fire, the same passion that had once made her heart race. His gaze was often distant, like he was looking at her through a haze, as though the woman standing before him was a dream he couldn't quite remember. But now and then there was a flicker, a brief moment, when something deep within him stirred. A slight shift in his expression, the way his brow furrowed just so, or the way his hand would tremble when it brushed against hers. In those moments, Maya saw the man she had loved, the man who had once looked at her with such fierce devotion. And she clung to those moments like a lifeline. It was late one evening when it happened again. Jack had been quieter than usual, sitting in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows over his face. He had been staring at a family photo on the mantel for what seemed like an eternity, his gaze fixed on the image of a much younger version of himself standing beside Maya and Zoe in a park, their smiles so wide, so carefree. The memory felt distant to Maya, as if it belonged to someone else, someone she had known long ago. She watched him from the doorway, her heart aching. He was so close and yet so far away. She longed for him to remember to come back to her, but she knew that wasn't something she could make happen. It had to come from him, from the memories that were buried deep within him, just waiting to be unearthed. Jack, Maya's voice was soft, hesitant, as if testing the waters of some unspoken bond. He didn't turn her right away. Instead, his eyes lingered on the photo a little longer, his lips pressing together as if he were trying to make sense of something that eluded him. Finally, he looked up at her, his gaze distant but not cold, more like someone waking from a long, hazy dream. Maya, he said her name with the same uncertainty that had marked his words for months. But there was something in the way he said it, an echo of recognition, faint but present. She stepped into the room, her breath catching in her throat. "Yes, Jack." She couldn't stop the small smile that curled on her lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He had said her name. The connection, however fragile, was there. "I keep seeing things," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper, as though he were speaking to himself more than to her. "Flashes, I mean. Pictures, moments, but they're all just out of reach." He looked down at his hands as if searching for answers in the familiar but foreign grip of his fingers. "It's like I've lived a life, but it's someone else's." Maya's heart clenched in her chest, but she forced herself to breathe. "I know Jack," she replied softly, walking toward him. She sat beside him on the couch, close but not too close. "I know. It's going to take time. You don't have to remember everything all at once." He didn't respond right away, and for a long moment they sat in silence, the weight of his words hanging between them like a heavy fog. Then, almost as though the words were slipping out before he could stop them, Jack spoke again. "I see her sometimes," he said quietly, almost absently. "A woman. I don't know who she is, but I keep seeing her in my dreams. And she looks at me like she knows me, like we've been together." His voice faltered, and he looked at Maya, his eyes searching hers for some kind of explanation. "I can't make sense of it. Why does she look at me like that? Maya felt her breath catch in her throat. She knew exactly who he was talking about. It was her. In the quiet moments when he allowed himself to sink into his dreams, he saw her, the woman he had once called his wife, the woman whose heart he had held in his hands without ever realizing how precious it was. That woman, Maya said softly, her voice thick with emotion. That's me, Jack. He turned to face her fully now, his brow furrowing, as if trying to connect the dots, as if her words were slowly finding a place in the labyrinth of his mind. He searched her face, his eyes filled with something close to wonder, and yet still so distant. You, he whispered as though the realization was just beginning to form, but it was tangled in the fog of his fractured memory. You're my wife. Maya nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek despite her efforts to keep it at bay. Yes, Jack, I am. And I've been waiting for you. The silence stretched between them again, but this time it was different. There was a shift in the air, something almost imperceptible, but undeniably present. Jack was looking at her now, really looking at her, and in his gaze she saw something stir, a flicker of recognition, fleeting but real. His hand reached out tentatively, as though afraid that the simple act of touch might shatter the fragile thread of connection between them. But when his fingers brushed against hers, Maya felt it. A quiet spark, a recognition that was more than memory, more than images in his mind. It was something deeper, something primal that neither time nor trauma could erase. You're my wife, Jack said again this time, with more certainty, his voice steady. And we have a daughter, Zoe. Maya smiled, the tears falling freely now as she clasped his hand in hers. Yes, Zoe, she's ours, Jack. For the first time in months, Maya saw a flicker of the man she had loved, the man who had once held her close and whispered promises of forever. It wasn't complete, not yet, but it was a beginning, the beginning of the journey back to each other. Jack's eyes softened, his hand tightening around hers. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm sorry, I don't remember anymore. You don't have to apologize, Maya replied, her voice thick with emotion. You're here, Jack. That's all that matters. He leaned toward her, then his face inches from hers, and for the first time since the accident, Maya felt the breath of their love, faint but undeniable, swirling between them. There were no grand declarations, no promises of perfect memories. But in that moment, with Jack's hand in hers and his eyes finally seeing her again, Maya knew that this fragile, broken beginning was enough. They were beginning again, and though the road ahead was still uncertain, they would walk it together, step by step. The weight of the silence in the house was almost suffocating. Maya sat on the couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her thoughts swirling in an endless loop. Jack had come so far, yet there was a part of her, a deep instinctive part, that still wondered if he would ever fully return to her, to the life they had once shared. His recovery had been slow, his memories fragmentary, but there were moments like today when the fog seemed to lift for just an instant and she could glimpse the man she had loved. But those moments were fleeting, and they left behind a sense of longing that was impossible to ignore. Maya had always believed that love was something that transcended time, that no amount of separation could ever truly sever the bond between two people who were meant to be together. But now, sitting in the stillness of the room, she wondered if she had been wrong. The doorbell rang, breaking the quiet, and Maya's heart skipped a beat. She stood quickly, her hands still trembling, and made her way to the door. She wasn't expecting anyone. She hadn't received any phone calls, no letters, no messages. Who could it be? When she opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. Standing on the doorstep were two figures, the last people she had ever expected to see. Jack's parents, Margaret and Richard Miller, impeccably dressed, as always, stood with an air of controlled perfection, their eyes scanning the interior of the house as if they were judging it, assessing its worth. Margaret, with her silver hair and sharp features, looked every bit the matriarch, her expression a mixture of surprise and concern. Richard, tall and imposing, his jaw set in that familiar line that Maya had once found intimidating, stood beside her, his eyes calculating as if he were sizing her up all over again. Maya's pulse quickened and a sense of dread settled in her chest. What were they doing here? They hadn't visited once since Jack's accident, not once. They had never even bothered to check in on him. She had tried in vain to keep their distance from Jack's recovery, knowing that their presence would only complicate things further. But now here they were standing on her doorstep, as though they had every right to be here. Margaret said, her voice smooth but laced with an edge that Maya had never liked. "We need to speak with Jack." Maya stood in the doorway, blocking their way, her gaze steady but wary. "I'm not sure Jack is ready for visitors," she replied, her voice cold despite the tightness in her chest. "He's still recovering." Richard's eyes narrowed and he exchanged a look with Margaret. "We're his parents," he said, his voice carrying an unmistakable authority. "We need to see him." Maya could feel the walls closing in on her, the tension rising like a storm. They had no right. They had abandoned him. They had never even given him the chance to heal in peace. They had forced him into their world of expectations and lies, and now they were here demanding something she wasn't sure she was willing to give. But before she could say anything more, a voice from behind her interrupted. Maya let them in. Jack's voice was soft, but it carried an undeniable weight. Maya turned to find him standing at the entrance to the living room, his expression unreadable, though his eyes flickered with something Maya couldn't quite place. He wasn't fully recovered, not yet, but in that moment he looked like the man she had once known. The man who had always put family first. "Maya." "It's fine," Jack repeated, taking a few slow steps toward the door. He looked at his parents, then back at her, his gaze uncertain as if he was trying to make sense of the situation. "They're my family." Maya's chest tightened, but she forced herself to nod, stepping aside to let them in. As they passed her, Margaret offered a smile that was as cold as ice, and Richard gave her a curt nod, both of them too proud to even acknowledge the discomfort that lay heavy in the air. Maya could already feel the weight of their presence in her home, the pressure building with every second they remained. Jack led them to the living room where they all took seats in silence. Maya stood by the window, her arms crossed over her chest, watching them carefully. She had always known that Jack's family had their expectations for him for his life. They had never approved of her, never understood her, but she had never realized how far they would go to control him, to control their lives. Jack sat across from his parents, his eyes searching their faces for something, anything that would explain why they were here. He had no memory of their cruelty, no memory of the pressure they had placed on him, but Maya did. And now as she stood silently in the background, she could feel the old wounds reopening. "I want to know what happened, Mom." Dad, Jack began, his voice steady, though there was a quiet edge to it. "Why haven't you come to see me? Why didn't you visit when I was in the hospital?" Margaret's gaze flickered, but she quickly masked it with a practiced smile. "We didn't want to upset you, Jack," she said smoothly, as though her words were rehearsed. "We knew you needed time to heal, and we didn't want to overwhelm you." Richard's voice was less smooth, more calculated. "But the truth is, Jack, we've been trying to protect you from the lies, from all the chaos." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "You've been in a fragile state, and now we see that you've been living with someone who's not the woman we thought you were married to." Maya's heart dropped into her stomach. What did he mean? Jack's expression shifted, confusion clouding his features. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. Margaret's smile faded, and she leaned forward, her voice tinged with something darker. "You married a woman beneath you, Jack. She's not the person you thought she was. You didn't know her before the accident, and now you're living in a world of lies." Jack shook his head, his brows furrowing. "I don't understand. Who are you talking about?" Maya could feel her blood run cold as Richard spoke again, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. "The woman you married, Jack, was nothing more than a girl who trapped you into a life you didn't want. You didn't even know her before the accident. She's not who she pretends to be." Jack's confusion deepened, and Maya watched as he looked between his parents and then at her. His gaze softened, and for a brief moment she saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the uncertainty. But then it vanished, replaced by something else, anger. "No." His voice was firm now, the confusion giving way to something stronger. "That's not true. Maya is my wife. She's the woman I love, and I won't let you tell me otherwise." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Jack had spoken, and for the first time in months, Maya saw the man she had married, the man who wouldn't back down. And yet the words that had been said about her, about their life, stung deeply. She knew that Jack was only beginning to uncover the truth, and that truth was far more complicated than either of them could have imagined. As Richard and Margaret sat in stunned silence, Jack turned to Maya, his eyes filled with something she couldn't read. I don't know what they're talking about, but I know this. I know you, and I know what we've built together, and no one, not even my own family, can take that from us. Maya nodded, her heart swelling with a love that, for all its uncertainty, was still alive. And as the storm outside raged on, she knew that their battle was just beginning. But she also knew deep down that this was a fight worth having, for the truth, for their family, and for their love. The days had begun to slip by in a quiet haze, each one blending into the next like the soft murmur of waves against the shore. Maya's life, once full of certainty, had become a complex puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit together, edges jagged and rough, impossible to piece together with ease. She was caught in the space between the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming, uncertain of how to navigate the shifting ground beneath her feet. Jack's recovery had reached a delicate stage. He was no longer as lost as he had been in those first few months, but his memories remained fragmented like shards of glass scattered across the floor. The pieces were there somewhere waiting to be put together, but every time he reached for one, it eluded him, slipping just beyond his grasp. He was trying, she could see that, and yet something about him seemed so distant. He had no memory of the man he had been, no memory of the man who had fallen in love with her, who had stood by her through the ups and downs of life, who had promised her the world and more. Every word he spoke, every glance he gave her, was filtered through the lens of someone who was still searching for himself. And so was she. Maya stood in the kitchen, her hands moving mechanically as she prepared dinner, the knife slicing through the vegetables with rhythmic precision. She could feel the familiar weight of the silence pressing in on her, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the house. Jack was in the other room, his back to her, staring at the family photos on the wall, a thousand unanswered questions swirling in his mind. She could see him from where she stood, the lines of his back, rigid as though he were still holding himself together with fragile strings. It wasn't that she didn't love him. She did more than anything in the world. But the love that had once been so easy, so full of certainty, now felt like a delicate thread, one that could snap at any moment if she wasn't careful. She had to tread lightly to protect what little they had left, even as she fought to hold on to the hope that the man she had married would one day return to her. And then there was the question that had been gnawing at her, eating away at her insides for days. If Jack never fully remembered who they were, who would they become? Could they still be the family they had once been? Or would they always be a shadow of what could have been? Maya's mind wandered back to the days before the accident, before everything had changed. She had known who she was, then a mother, a wife, a woman who had dreams of a life shared with the man she loved. But now, in the aftermath of everything, she wasn't sure. She was still a mother, yes, but her role as a wife had become blurred. Jack didn't remember her as she had been. He didn't remember the life they had built together. And she, in turn, didn't quite know how to be the woman he needed her to be. She finished preparing the meal and set the table, the clink of plates and utensils the only sound in the room. It was a routine, a quiet routine that had become her solace. Even though so much had changed, this small act of preparing dinner, of caring for Jack and Zoe, still felt familiar, still felt like something she could control. As she set the last plate on the table, she glanced over at Jack again. He hadn't moved. He was still staring at the photos, his fingers lightly grazing the frame of one that depicted their wedding day. The image seemed to pierce through her heart, the memory of that day so vivid in her mind, so full of life and love. But Jack didn't know that man anymore. The man who had stood at the altar, his eyes filled with hope and certainty, was gone, replaced by someone who had to learn how to love her all over again. Jack, Maya called softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned, and for a moment their gazes locked, his, filled with the same uncertainty that had plagued him since his recovery, and hers filled with the weight of the love she still carried for him. It was a look they had shared countless times before, a look of quiet understanding. But now it seemed different, heavier, as if it were laden with the questions neither of them knew how to ask. "I've set the table," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Dinner's ready." He nodded, but the hesitance in his movements spoke volumes. He stood slowly, his body stiff as he walked toward her, his eyes lingering on the photos once more before he joined her at the table. She could see the struggle in him, the internal war, as he fought to remember, fought to piece together a life that no longer seemed to belong to him. They sat in silence, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. Maya could feel the words pressing against her chest, but she didn't know how to voice them. She didn't know how to ask Jack for the one thing she needed most, the thing that seemed so impossible now for him to come back to her. "Do you remember this day?" she asked quietly, her voice tentative as she gestured toward the wedding photo. Jack looked at the photo, his brow furrowing as he studied it, his fingers brushing against the frame once more. I, I don't know," he admitted, his voice soft, filled with the same regret that always followed his moments of uncertainty. "I want to remember. I do. But it's like trying to hold on to something that keeps slipping through my fingers." Maya's heart twisted in her chest. "It's okay, Jack," she whispered. "You don't have to remember everything, not all at once. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her, then really looked at her, and for the briefest of moments something flickered in his eyes, something so familiar that it took her breath away. It was the way he used to look at her, the way he used to see her. It was the look of a man who knew her, who understood her, who loved her without question. But just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, replaced by the same uncertainty that had plagued him for months. He smiled weakly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I don't know if I'll ever be the man I was before," he said quietly. "I don't know if I'll ever be the man you need." Maya reached across the table, her hand finding his, her fingers trembling as she squeezed it gently. "Jack," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't need to be the man you were. You're here. That's enough. We'll figure it out together." He nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a tenderness that sent a shiver down her. But Maya couldn't shake the feeling, the gnawing feeling that she was losing herself in the process of trying to hold on to him. She had always known who she was, always been certain of her place in the world. But now, standing here with Jack beside her and their daughter playing in the corner, she didn't know who she was anymore. She didn't know what she could be if Jack could never be the man she once knew, if their life could never return to what it was. The world she had built with him felt so distant now, like a dream that had long faded into the shadows. But she was here and so was he, and for now that had to be enough. They would figure out who they were together, one day at a time. The evening was unusually still, the air thick with the anticipation of something unspoken, something inevitable. Maya stood by the window, watching the shadows stretch across the yard as the last traces of sunlight faded into the horizon. She hadn't expected the evening to unfold like this. She hadn't expected Jack's parents, to show up at her door. She had heard nothing from them since the accident, and she had thought foolishly that they had finally accepted the reality of Jack's situation, that they had at least allowed him the space to heal, to find himself again in the aftermath of the wreckage. But today, their unexpected arrival had shattered the fragile peace she had fought so hard to build in their little home. The doorbell rang, and Maya's heart skipped in her chest. She wasn't ready for this. She didn't know if she would ever be ready. Still, she couldn't avoid it any longer. Taking a deep breath, she crossed the room and opened the door, her hand gripping the handle as though it were the only thing keeping her grounded. There, standing in front of her, were Margaret and Richard Miller, the parents who had spent so many years trying to shape Jack's life into something he wasn't. Now here they were looking at her as if she were the one who had done them a disservice. Margaret said, her voice smooth as silk, but there was an undercurrent of something sharper beneath the surface, something Maya recognized all too well. "We need to talk to Jack." Maya stepped back, not allowing them to enter immediately. Her heart raced as the words caught in her throat. She had been expecting this moment for months now, but she hadn't prepared herself for the gravity of it. "Jack's been through a lot," she replied carefully, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "He's still recovering. He's not ready for visitors." Richard Miller looked past her, his eyes scanning the room with a mix of judgment and disdain. "This is our son's house," he said with finality, his voice laced with authority. "We have a right to speak with him. We need to make sure he's not being taken advantage of." Maya's blood boiled at his words, the weight of them heavy and cutting. She wanted to argue, to tell him that they had no right, that they had abandoned Jack when he needed them most. But the words stuck in her throat. She couldn't afford to let her anger show, not now. "Jack's recovery is his journey," Maya said slowly, locking eyes with Richard. "Not yours. You don't get to control it." Margaret's eyes narrowed and her lips pressed into a thin line. "You don't understand what's at stake here, Maya," she said, her tone sharp, cutting. "This isn't just about Jack's memory loss. This is about his future, his legacy." Maya swallowed hard, the words stinging more than she had anticipated. She had always known that Jack's family had their expectations for him, but hearing them speak so coldly, so dispassionately about his future, sent a rush of bile to her throat. Jack wasn't just a figurehead to be paraded around. He was a man with a life, with feelings, with a family, and she wasn't about to let them take him from her again. "I don't care about your legacy," Maya said, her voice now filled with a quiet defiance. "What matters is that Jack is alive. What matters is that we are rebuilding our lives. Together." Margaret stepped forward, her posture rigid with authority. "We don't want to fight with you, Maya. We just want to make sure Jack is making decisions that are in his best interest." This woman, she paused, her eyes scanning Maya's face, as though trying to figure out how to strike her the hardest. This woman is not who he thinks she is. Maya's breath caught. This woman. The words were a cutting blow. She had always known that Jack's parents had never fully accepted her, but to hear it spoken aloud with such venom made her heart ache. She wasn't just a woman, she was his woman. She was the mother of their child. She had been there through everything when no one else had been. "And who do you think you are?" Maya finally asked, her voice low, but the fire in it undeniable. "Who do you think you are, walking into my house and telling me that you know what's best for Jack? You don't get to make decisions for him. You lost that right the moment you walked away from him when he needed you most." The silence that followed was thick with tension, like the moment before a storm unleashes its fury. Richard stood, his fists clenched at his sides, the veins in his neck standing out as though he were about to lash out. But it was Margaret who spoke first, her voice colder now than ever before. "We didn't abandon him," she said, the words sharp and unforgiving. "We did what we thought was best for him. We tried to protect him from you." Maya's heart skipped a beat. "From me," she repeated, her voice rising, though she fought to keep her composure. "You think Jack was better off without me? After everything we've been through? You think this?" She gestured around the house, the small, modest space they had made their home. "This is a mistake." Margaret took a step forward, her gaze never leaving Maya's. "Yes, I do," she said quietly. "I think you're a distraction, a hindrance to the man Jack was meant to be. You trapped him in a life he didn't choose. You trapped him with your baby." Maya's chest tightened, but she held her ground, her eyes never wavering. She could feel the weight of every word Margaret had spoken, each one like a shard of glass, aimed directly at her heart. But she wouldn't flinch. Not now. Not when Jack needed her most. She heard Jack's voice behind her, low and steady, cutting through the tension that hung thick in the room. "That's enough." Maya's heart leaped in her chest as Jack stepped into the room, his eyes focused solely on his parents. His stance was strong, though there was a tension in his body that she could feel even from where she stood. "No more accusations, no more lies." Jack continued, his voice firm, but tinged with something more, something vulnerable that Maya hadn't seen in him for months. "You don't get to tear apart what I've built. You don't get to tell me who I am or what I'm supposed to remember. I've already lost so much, and I'm not going to let you take the rest of me." The words hung in the air, like a confession, like the last thread of his old life, finally snapping the man he had been, now standing face to face with the people who had tried to erase him. Margaret's face flushed with anger, but Jack didn't back down. He stood tall, his eyes steady on them both. "You may be my parents," Jack said quietly, his voice softening, "but that doesn't mean you control my life. It doesn't mean you get to decide what's best for me." The silence that followed was thick, heavy, with the realization that everything they had tried to protect, everything they had tried to control, had slipped through their fingers. Jack was no longer the man they had shaped, the man they had planned for. He was his own, and the only thing that mattered now was the family he had chosen. Maya felt her heart swell as she looked at him, her Jack, the man who was finally seeing them, truly seeing them as they were. He was here. He was with her, and together they would face whatever came next. Because in the end, family was not something to be controlled or manipulated. It was something to be built together. The quiet of the house was a comfort Maya hadn't realized she had been longing for. After the confrontation with Jack's parents, the tension that had simmered for so long finally began to dissipate, though it left behind the sharp sting of what had been said. Maya stood in the kitchen, her hands still shaking as she put the dishes away, but her mind kept drifting back to Jack. She could feel him, his presence in the house, a constant that had both grounded her and made her heart ache. The world outside continued to turn, the days stretching on like soft, endless waves. But inside their little home, there was something different in the air. The quiet comfort of routine had returned, yes, but it felt as though they were no longer merely existing in the space of their memories. They were building something again, creating a new future together, even though Jack still had so much to reclaim from his past. The change in him was subtle, but it was there in the way he moved through their days and the way he spoke to her with a gentleness that she had almost forgotten. There were still gaps in his memory, still days when he would look at her as though searching for a piece of himself that had yet to return. But there were moments, 2 moments, when he would reach for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers with a quiet intimacy that reminded her of the man she had married. Maya closed the cupboard, her hands lingering on the wood as she turned to face him. Jack was standing by the window, looking out over the yard, his hands shoved in his pockets. He was still recovering, still piecing together who he was. But in this moment, Maya saw something in him, a spark, a glimmer of the man she had once loved, the man who had chosen her, who had chosen their life. Jack, her voice was soft, tentative. She didn't know how to navigate this new space they found themselves in, but she had to try. She had to reach for him, even if she wasn't sure what he needed from her anymore. He turned toward her slowly, his gaze meeting hers with a quiet intensity. "Yeah." Maya took a deep breath, her heart swelling with an emotion she couldn't quite name. She had been so afraid of what this moment would feel like, so terrified of the distance between them, of how much had been lost. But standing here now in the warm light of their kitchen, she realized that the distance wasn't as vast as she had feared. It was a chasm that could be bridged. It was a beginning, not an end. "I was thinking," she began, her words tentative but sure, "about us, about where we go from here." Jack stepped closer, his expression softening as he met her halfway. "I know," he said, his voice low but steady. "I've been thinking about that too, about us." The words hung between them, a shared understanding that neither of them needed to speak aloud. They had been through so much together already, so much pain, so much grief, but there was still love there. Love that hadn't gone anywhere. It was buried beneath the rubble, hidden in the silence of the past few months, but it was still there, waiting to be uncovered, waiting for them both to reach for it again. "We'll figure this out." Jack continued, his voice steady, as though making a promise to both of them. "I don't remember everything, Maya, but I remember you. I remember how I felt when I looked at you. I know that much." Maya felt a lump rise in her throat. Her eyes stung with the tenderness of his words, the quiet certainty in his voice. She had been so afraid that he would never come back to her, that he would always be lost to her in some way. But now, standing here with him, she understood something deeper. He had always been here, even when he couldn't remember. "I need you to know something," Maya said, her voice trembling as she stepped closer to him. I've been scared, scared of what this means, of what we might lose. But I'm not scared anymore, Jack. I'm not. Jack reached out his hand, gently cupping her face, his touch warm against her skin. We're not losing anything, Maya, he whispered, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that took her breath away. We're building something new. Maya closed her eyes, the warmth of his hand on her cheek grounding her, giving her a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. Building something new. Those words echoed in her mind, a simple but profound truth that she hadn't realized she needed to hear. They didn't need to go back to the way things were. They didn't need to find some way to pick up the pieces of a past that had already slipped through their fingers. What they needed was to move forward, together. When she opened her eyes again, Jack was still watching her, his gaze tender as though he were waiting for her to say the words that would change everything. And she knew in that moment that the words didn't need to be spoken at all. They didn't need to define what they had. They only needed to live it. Maya smiled softly, her heart swelling with love for this man who, despite everything, had never truly left her. Together, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Together, Jack agreed, a quiet promise in his eyes. And for the first time in months, Maya felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel: hope. A hope for a future that wasn't defined by what they had lost, but by what they could still build together. The evening stretched on the sounds of their quiet conversation filling the house. They talked about Zoe, about their dreams for the future, about everything and nothing at all. But as the hours passed, Maya realized something she hadn't quite understood before. She didn't need to hold on to the past to move forward. She didn't need Jack to remember everything for them to begin again. They would write their own story, and this time it would be theirs. Completely. That night, as they sat together on the couch, Zoe curled up in her lap, Jack by her side, Maya felt the weight of the past few months begin to lift. There was no magic cure for amnesia, no instant fix to erase the pain they had both endured, but there was something stronger than memory, love, and that in the end was enough. They had come through the storm, and now as the sun began to rise on a new day, Maya knew that a new chapter was beginning, and this time they would write it together. The morning light filtered gently through the window, casting soft shadows on the walls of the living room. It was a quiet kind of morning, still peaceful, the world outside slowly waking up as the birds outside began their chorus of song. Maya sat on the couch, the warm glow of the early sun touching her skin, while Zoe played with her toys on the floor beside her. Her laughter a soft, sweet melody that made Maya's heart swell with a tenderness that could only come from a mother's love. Jack was at the window, standing as he often did these days, his eyes scanning the quiet street. Maya watched him from across the room, noticing the way his posture had changed over the past few weeks. How his back was straighter now, how his gaze was steadier, more focused. He was still working through the maze of his memories, still trying to piece together the past he had lost. But something about him had shifted. He was more present, more engaged in the life they were building together, and Maya felt something inside her stir, a quiet sense of hope that she hadn't allowed herself to feel for a long time. He turned toward her, then his expression softening as their eyes met. There was a moment of stillness between them, one of those fleeting moments that carried the weight of everything unsaid. And in that moment, Maya saw it, the faintest spark of recognition in his eyes, not of specific memories, but of something deeper, something that transcended the fragments of the past, something that told her with quiet certainty that he was still the man she had married, the man who had promised her forever. I've been thinking, Jack said, his voice breaking the silence, though it was soft, like he was testing the waters of something uncertain. About what you said the other night. Maya's chest tightened, and she held her breath, not sure where this conversation was going, but sensing that it was something important. What did I say? She asked, her voice gentle. You said that we're building something new, Jack said, stepping away from the window and crossing the room toward her. His eyes were steady now, no longer the distant gaze of someone lost in his mind. I think I'm starting to understand what you meant. Maya's heart fluttered in her chest, but she didn't speak. She just waited, her hands resting in her lap. Zoe's tiny fingers tugging at the hem of her shirt, a reminder of the life they were rebuilding together. I don't remember everything, Jack continued, his voice low, but there was a steadiness to it now that made Maya feel like they were standing on the edge of something. But I remember enough. I remember what it feels like to be with you. And I remember what it felt like when I realized that Zoe, our daughter, was mine. Maya's throat tightened and she had to swallow to keep her composure. She hadn't realized just how deeply she had been holding her breath until he said those words. It was one thing for Jack to remember her, to remember the love they had shared, but for him to recognize the bond between them as a family that was something different, something more precious than anything she could have imagined. I know I wasn't there for you both, Jack continued, his voice thick with emotion, and I can't change that. But I want to be. I want to be the father Zoe deserves. I want to be the husband you deserve. Maya felt the weight of his words settle on her heart like a soft, comforting weight, the kind that made her feel both grounded and completely seen. You are Jack, she whispered, her voice barely audible as she reached out to take his hand. You don't have to prove anything to me. We're already building it, this life, this family. And you're here now. That's all that matters. Jack's eyes searched hers, and for a moment Maya thought she saw something flicker in the depth of his gaze, a mix of uncertainty and hope. But before she could say anything more, he crouched down beside her, looking at Zoe, who had finally managed to gather her toys into a small pile and was now contentedly humming to herself as she played. I've missed so much, Jack said softly, his voice filled with regret. I've missed so many of these moments. But I'm here now and I want to be a part of everything. I want to be the one who watches her grow up, who helps you with all the little things, and the big things too. Maya smiled, the warmth of his words filling her chest. You already are, she whispered, leaning down to kiss the top of Zoe's head, her hand resting lightly on Jack's. We've been building this, Jack, together, and now we have a chance to make up for all the time we lost. The silence between them was filled with the soft sound of Zoe's laughter, her tiny hands grasping at Jack's fingers, and Maya couldn't help but feel a wave of gratitude wash over her. Life had never been easy, had never gone the way they had imagined it. But in this moment, with Jack beside her, with their daughter in their arms, everything felt as it should be. Maya looked at Jack, her heart full. What do you think, Zoe? She asked, glancing down at their daughter, who was now reaching up for Jack's hand with bright, eager eyes. Zoe's chubby fingers wrapped around Jack's, and she giggled, the sound pure and untainted, a reminder of the joy that still existed between them. Jack's gaze softened as he watched their daughter, and for the first time since the accident, Maya saw him not as the man who had lost everything, not as the man still searching for pieces of a past he couldn't remember, but as the man who was standing beside her. Now the man who was learning to be a father again, who was finding his place in their world. I think, Jack said, his voice a mixture of wonder and certainty, we're just getting started. And in that moment, Maya realized that he was right. They were just getting started. It wasn't going to be easy. There would still be challenges, still be moments when they would have to rebuild, to reimagine what it meant to be a family. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that they were together. What mattered was that Jack had come back to her, had come back to them, and together they were creating a new chapter in their story, one that was theirs to write, one that was filled with love, with hope, and with the quiet certainty that no matter what came next, they would face it together. Zoe reached up her hands, grasping at Jack's face, and he leaned down, kissing her forehead gently. Maya watched them, her heart full, knowing that they were no longer just surviving. They were living, building, rediscovering what it meant to be a family. And in that quiet, peaceful moment, she knew with everything in her that this was just the beginning. The mornings had begun to take on a rhythm, a comforting pattern that Maya had once feared she would never experience again. The soft light of dawn would spill across the room, illuminating the space where Jack, Zoe, and she now shared their days. The mornings were quiet but not empty. They were filled with the laughter of a toddler, the clinking of dishes, the gentle murmur of Jack's voice as he tried ever so carefully to find his place in their world once more. But the quiet was deceptive. Underneath the surface of their newfound routine, There were still things left unsaid, things that had yet to be fully resolved. Jack's memory was still a patchwork of fragments, and though he had returned to them with a commitment that touched her soul, Maya couldn't ignore the subtle gaps that lingered between them. They were moving forward, yes, but in the back of her mind, a small part of her wondered, could they ever truly rebuild the love they once had, or were they destined to live in the shadow of what had been lost? The question haunted her as she made breakfast that morning, her hands moving mechanically as she prepared the meal. Jack had already taken Zoe for a walk, giving her a quiet moment to herself, but even in the solitude, her thoughts were restless. She had tried so hard to push her fears aside, to focus on the present, to be grateful for what they had. But it wasn't enough. The love they had shared, the passion and the fire, the certainty had been shattered by his accident. And though they were building something new, Maya couldn't help but wonder if it would ever be the same. The sound of the door opening broke her reverie, and Jack's voice called out from the hallway light, and cheerful, the sound of a man who had found a purpose again. Breakfast almost ready, Maya called over her shoulder, a smile tugging at her lips as she glanced toward the door. But the smile faltered as she saw him standing there, his hands stuffed in the pockets of his jacket, his eyes distant. Jack hadn't said much about the walk, about the moments alone with Zoe. Maya knew he was trying to reconnect with his daughter, to be present in ways he hadn't been before. And yet as she looked at him now, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something beneath the surface. His posture was still stiff, his gaze still searching, as if he were standing at the edge of a precipice, afraid to take the next step. "Jack," she asked softly, her voice tinged with concern. He blinked, his gaze flickering back to her, as if he hadn't realized she was watching him. Yeah, his voice was distant, and it stung Maya more than she cared to admit. "Everything okay?" she asked, wiping her hands on the dish towel. She knew he wasn't the same man he had been before the accident, but she also knew he was still struggling to piece together who he was now. And it wasn't easy for either of them. Jack gave a small shrug, his lips pressing together in a tight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, just thinking." Maya didn't speak at first. She didn't know how to fill the silence, how to make the distance between them feel smaller. She had been patient, so patient. She had been the one to comfort him when his memories refused to return, the one who held the family together, who quietly wished for the day when he would see her as his wife again, when he would remember their life, their love. But Jack didn't seem to notice the strain in her silence, or if he did, he didn't acknowledge it. He stepped forward, his hand resting on her shoulder, as if the act of touch could bridge the gap between them. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for everything." Maya swallowed, blinking back the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. She hadn't expected him to apologize. Not this way. Not for the way he had lost himself. Not for the things he couldn't control. She had been waiting for him to find his way back to her, but in this moment it felt like the apology was more than just for the past. It was a recognition of what they were still trying to rebuild. "You don't have to apologize," Maya replied, her voice soft, steady. "None of this is your fault. You're here. That's what matters." Jack nodded, but his gaze shifted as though he were searching for something just out of reach. "But I still don't remember everything," he said, his voice filled with quiet frustration. "I don't remember how you were before all of this. I don't remember the way you looked at me, the way we were." Maya's heart twisted in her chest. She had known this. She had known that the fragments of their love, the memories of their shared past, would never be fully restored. But hearing it from him, hearing him voice the very thing she feared the most, brought everything to the surface. The fear, the loss, the uncertainty. "You don't need to remember all of it," Maya said, her voice shaking slightly despite herself. "We can build something new, Jack. Together." He looked at her, then really looked at her, and there it was, the recognition. Not of a specific memory, but of something deeper, something that was unmistakably theirs. His hand reached for hers, his fingers brushing against her skin, with a tenderness that made her breath catch in her throat. "I want to remember," Jack whispered, "but I don't know how. I don't know how to love you the way I once did if I can't remember why I loved you. Maya squeezed his hand, her eyes closing for a moment as she fought to steady herself. You don't have to, she whispered. I love you. That's enough for me. She could feel the weight of his gaze, the heaviness of the words between them, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe in them. They were rebuilding. They were not the same as they once were. But maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Because what they had now, what they could still have, was theirs to create. Their love wasn't lost, it was just waiting to be rediscovered. Jack looked down at their hands, his thumb gently tracing the lines of her palm. I'm afraid he admitted, his voice low, raw, with the vulnerability he had always tried to hide. Maya felt a pang in her chest. She had been afraid too, so afraid of losing him forever, of losing herself in the process. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She didn't need him to remember everything. She didn't need him to be the man he was before. She just needed him to be here, to be present, to choose her, and to choose their daughter, and to choose the family they were learning to become together. I'm afraid too, she confessed softly, but I know that we can do this. I know we can rebuild this together, whatever it takes. Jack's eyes met hers, and in that moment, Maya saw it, the flicker of trust that had been missing for so long. Trust that could only come from shared struggle, shared loss, and the quiet, steadfast commitment to never give up. Not on each other, not on this. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her in a gesture of quiet strength. She leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to relax, to believe. They didn't have all the answers. Their love wasn't perfect, it was broken, fragile in some ways, but it was theirs, and that was enough. I love you, Jack whispered, his voice muffled against her hair. I love you too, Maya replied, her heart full with the promise of what they would rebuild together. And in that moment she knew they had everything they needed to start again. The late afternoon light spilled softly across the kitchen table, casting long golden shadows that stretched lazily across the floor. Maya sat at the table, her fingers wrapped around her coffee mug, as she watched Jack from across the room. His expression was focused, almost lost in concentration, as he prepared Zoe's bottles. The once unfamiliar rhythm of parenting had slowly, imperceptibly become their new normal. They had navigated the roughest terrain together, his memory loss, the uncertainty of their future, and now they were learning to find their way in the quiet spaces of their life. Maya took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling over her like a soft blanket. She had always dreamed of this life of a family, of raising her child with the man she loved, but the reality of it was more complicated than she could have imagined. Parenthood had tested them in ways they hadn't expected, demanding things from them, both that they weren't sure they were capable of giving. Jack's memory had returned in bits and pieces. Some days he remembered Zoe's first steps. Other days he could recall the simple joy of taking her to the park. But there were still gaps, moments where the past was a blur, and Maya often found herself filling in the spaces, teaching him what it felt like to be a father. She hadn't expected this part of the journey, this quiet daily act of rediscovery, but she embraced it because it meant that Jack was here, truly present, even if the memories were still elusive. Tonight was one of those nights where everything seemed a little off kilter. Zoe had been fussy for hours, her tiny body restless, her cries sharp and insistent. Maya could feel the tension building between them, a quiet frustration creeping into the corners of her mind as she watched Jack struggle to calm her. She's been like this all day, Maya said quietly, watching Jack attempt to soothe Zoe in his arms. His face was a mixture of patience and worry. She won't stop crying. Maybe she's teething, or maybe, I don't know, Jack interrupted, his voice tight, his brow furrowed in concern. But I feel like I'm doing something wrong. Maya's heart twisted at his words. He had been trying so hard, trying so desperately to be the father Zoe deserved, but it was like he was still learning, still feeling his way through it all. She could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the doubt that lingered there, and she knew exactly where it came from. He didn't remember the first few months of Zoe's life. He hadn't been there for her when she needed him most. And though he had slowly stepped into the role of father, that deep fear of failing still haunted him. "You're not doing anything wrong," Maya said softly, her voice reassuring. She stepped toward him, taking a gentle hold of Zoe's hand as Jack looked up at her, his eyes filled with both relief and uncertainty. "We're figuring it out together, okay? We're a team. Always." Jack nodded, though the tension in his shoulders didn't dissipate. "I want to be good for her, Maya. I want to be the kind of father she deserves. But every time she cries like this, it's like I'm failing her. Failing both of you." Maya placed a hand on his shoulder, her fingers resting there warm and steady. "You're not failing us, Jack," she whispered. "You're here, and that's all we need." She knew he was trying. She could see it in the way he looked at Zoe, the tenderness in his touch when he held her, the effort he put into understanding every little need of their daughter. But being a father was harder than he had ever expected, harder than either of them had ever expected. The room was silent for a moment, save for the quiet sobs of their daughter, her tiny body trembling in Jack's arms. Maya's heart ached for both of them, the man who was still trying to remember the feeling of fatherhood and the child who had never known him as a constant presence. Then in that stillness, Jack spoke again, his voice quieter, now softer. "I don't know if I can do this alone. I don't know if I can be the father I want to be." Maya looked at him, really looked at him, at the vulnerability in his eyes, the rawness of his admission. For so long, Jack had carried the weight of his amnesia like a burden, believing that he was missing pieces of himself. But in that moment, Maya knew what he didn't yet realize, that being a father wasn't about perfect memories. It was about showing up, about being there even when you didn't know what you were doing. "I'm not asking you to do it alone," Maya said gently. "You don't have to. We're in this together, Jack. And I know you'll be the father Zoe needs. You already are." Jack didn't respond right away. His eyes flickered to Zoe, who had quieted slightly in his arms, her tiny face still scrunched in discomfort, her little hands fisted at her sides. It wasn't a perfect moment. It wasn't the easy, seamless picture of parenthood they had once imagined. But it was theirs. It was real. Jack looked back at Maya, his gaze steady, filled with something new, something that had been missing for so long. He hadn't remembered everything, but in that moment, Maya knew he was beginning to understand what it meant to be a father, what it meant to be a part of their family. He gently rocked Zoe in his arms, his movements slow and steady, and Maya watched him with a quiet pride. She didn't need him to have all the answers. She didn't need him to remember every moment they had shared. All she needed was for him to keep trying, to keep showing up, even when it was hard. And Jack was doing that. He was here. That was enough. Zoe's cries had slowed, her small body relaxing against Jack's chest. And for the first time in what felt like hours, the room was filled with silence. The kind of silence that only came with the settling of a child's rest. Jack's breathing had evened out, his body relaxing as he gently rocked their daughter, soothing her into sleep. Maya felt a quiet peace settle over her as she watched them, Jack, the father who was still learning, and Zoe, the daughter who had become the heartbeat of their world. They weren't perfect. Their life together wouldn't be flawless. But in this moment, Maya knew that this was what it meant to be a family. She stepped forward, her hand resting on Jack's back as he turned to look at her. His eyes softened, filled with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something that felt like acceptance. He had faced the hardest part of being a father, the doubt. And now for the first time, Maya saw him begin to let go of that uncertainty. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice full of emotion. For what Maya asked, her heart swelling with the quiet love that had blossomed between them over the months. "For being patient with me," Jack replied. "For believing in me." Maya smiled, her hand resting on his shoulder as she looked at their daughter, now peacefully asleep in his arms. "I've always believed in you, Jack. I always will." And in that moment, with Zoe safely cradled between them, Jack's arm around Maya, they knew that they had passed a test. Parenthood wasn't easy, and it never would be. But they would face it together. They had already survived the hardest part together. The storm inside them both had finally quieted, and though the road ahead would still be long, they had learned something that day. That love, even when it was new and unformed, even when it was uncertain, was the foundation they had been building from the very beginning. Together, always together. The evening had started off like any other, quiet and slow, with the hum of the refrigerator in the background and the soft clatter of dishes being put away after dinner. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the house was filled with the warm golden glow of the lamps as Maya settled into the couch. Zoe curled up in her lap, her tiny body warm and trusting. Jack was in the kitchen washing the dishes, his movements steady, his posture relaxed. It felt like life was finally settling into something resembling normalcy. But the calm was fleeting. Maya's phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling her from the gentle rhythm of the evening. She glanced down at the screen and her heart skipped a beat. It was a message from Jack's doctor. "Maya, I need to speak with you as soon as possible. It's important." Her fingers went cold as she read the message again, her mind racing. Why would the doctor be reaching out like this? Was something wrong? Her heart thudded in her chest and she felt the familiar tightness in her throat, the cold grip of fear wrapping around her. Maya Jack's voice came from the kitchen, warm and soft, but it was enough to snap her back to the present. She quickly tucked the phone into her pocket, trying to steady her breath. "Yeah," she called, her voice unsteady. "Everything okay?" Jack asked, walking into the living room, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He raised an eyebrow, his gaze moving over her face, noticing the tension in her posture. "Just got a message from Dr. Walker," she said, trying to sound casual. But the words fell flat, her voice betraying the fear rising in her chest. "She wants to talk to me. Says it's important." Jack's eyes narrowed, his face falling into an expression of concern. He stepped closer to her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "Maya, what's going on?" Maya took a deep breath, her mind racing as she forced herself to focus on Jack. She couldn't let herself spiral. Not now. Not when they had worked so hard to come this far. "I'm sure it's nothing," she said, offering him a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's probably about the test from last week. I'll give her a call and see what she needs." Jack nodded slowly, but the unease that had settled between them wasn't something that could easily be ignored. Maya's hand trembled as she reached for the phone, dialing Dr. Walker's number. It rang once, twice, and then she heard the familiar voice on the other end. "Maya, I'm so sorry to call you like this." Dr. Walker's voice crackled with a gentle but unmistakable urgency. "There's been a complication with Jack's latest tests. I think it's important we talk in person." Maya's stomach dropped. "Complication? What's wrong?" The words came out before she could stop them, panic creeping into her tone despite her best efforts to remain calm. "I'd rather explain in person," Dr. Walker said, her voice tight with concern. "Can you meet me at the hospital? It's urgent." Maya nodded, though Dr. Walker couldn't see her. "I'll be there in 30 minutes. She hung up the phone with shaky hands, the weight of the conversation hanging heavily in the air. Jack was still standing beside her, his eyes wide with worry, waiting for her to speak. "What did she say?" Jack asked, his voice low, the tension between them palpable. Maya closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath before meeting his gaze. "She wants me to come to the hospital. It's about your tests." "Something's wrong, Jack." Jack's expression shifted from concern to something deeper, something closer to fear. "What do you mean something's wrong?" His voice grew more insistent. "What did she say?" "I don't know, Jack," Maya replied, her words a whisper, as she stood up, her legs feeling suddenly unsteady. She didn't go into detail, but she said it was important. She wants to talk in person. Jack didn't move, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. "I'm coming with you," he said, his voice firm. Maya hesitated, her eyes flickering to Zoe, who was still nestled in her lap, unaware of the growing tension. The thought of taking Jack to the hospital, the thought of facing whatever news awaited them together, was too much. She had to protect him, protect them. She couldn't bear the thought of putting him through anything that might set him back. "Jack, no. You need to stay with Zoe. You need to rest." The words came out stronger than she had intended, a quiet edge of frustration cutting through her worry. But Jack didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped forward, his hand finding hers, his grip gentle but unyielding. "Maya, I'm not staying here. I'm not going to sit by while you deal with this alone. Whatever it is, we face it together. We always do." His words settled over her like a balm, soothing some of the panic that had been swirling in her chest. She knew he was right. They had already weathered so much. Whatever this was, they would face it together. She nodded, taking his hand and squeezing it tightly. Okay, we'll go together. The hospital was quieter than usual when they arrived, the sterile lights above, casting an unnatural glow on the white walls. The air smelled of antiseptic, of medicine, of sterile clinical precision. Maya's heart pounded in her chest each step toward the waiting room, a reminder of how fragile the peace they had found truly was. Jack's hand was firm in hers as they walked down the hallway, his steps steady, but his eyes betraying the unease that had settled in him. Maya couldn't blame him. She was afraid too, afraid of what they might learn, afraid of how it would affect him, and afraid of what it would mean for their family. When they reached Dr. Walker's office, Maya knocked softly on the door, her pulse racing as she waited for the invitation to enter. The door opened almost immediately, and Dr. Walker stepped out, her expression somber. Maya, Jack, she greeted them, her eyes flickering over them both, before settling on Jack with a mixture of empathy and concern. I'm glad you could make it. Please come in. They entered the office and Maya sat beside Jack as Dr. Walker closed the door behind them. There was no easy way to start this conversation. The uncertainty in the air was palpable, thickening with every passing second. I'm sorry to have to bring you in here like this. Dr. Walker began, her voice quiet and measured. But the results of Jack's latest tests have raised some concerns. We found something that requires immediate attention. Maya felt her stomach twist, her breath catching in her throat. What could it be? Jack's grip on her hand tightened, and she turned to look at him. Her eyes filled with the same fear that gnawed at her insides. She couldn't lose him again. She couldn't bear it. What's wrong, Dr. Jack asked, his voice steady, but filled with the uncertainty he refused to show. Dr. Walker looked at them both, her gaze heavy with unspoken words. Jack, the scans we've done show signs of a secondary complication. It's related to the brain injury you sustained in the accident. We believe there may be further damage that's affecting your cognitive recovery. It's possible that it's interfering with your memory more than we originally thought. Maya felt her breath catch in her chest, her head spinning with the weight of the words. What does that mean for Jack? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. It means that while we've been focusing on your immediate recovery, Jack, we may need to consider more intensive treatment. It's a process, but we can help. We need to monitor you closely in the coming weeks. Maya looked at Jack, who was silent, his face pale as he processed the news. His mind was already racing. She could see it, the fear, the uncertainty, the sense that everything was unraveling all over again. But then, to her surprise, he met her gaze, his eyes clearer than she had seen in months. We'll figure it out, he said quietly, his voice filled with a quiet determination. Together. And in that moment, Maya knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it the same way they always had together. The days following the news from the hospital were heavy with an unspoken tension, a quiet weight that hung in the air between Maya and Jack. It wasn't a burden of despair, but something more subtle, like the remnants of a storm that had passed, but left its imprint on the landscape. Every day felt like a quiet reckoning, each moment asking them to confront the truths that had been left untouched for so long. The past, its joys and its sorrows, had always seemed so real, so tangible. But now, in the wake of Jack's diagnosis, it felt like an old photograph, fading at the edges, no longer as sharp or as certain as it had once been. Maya stood in front of the window, watching the world outside, a world that continued to move forward regardless of what was happening inside the walls of their home. The sky was a muted gray, the trees swaying gently in the breeze as if everything was untouched by the turmoil they had been facing. Zoe played on the floor behind her, her giggles rising and falling, like a song that could wash away the dust of all their unspoken fears. Jack had spent the past few days in a daze, a quiet retreat into himself, as he processed the information from the doctor. He hadn't pulled away, not in the way Maya had feared, but there was something different about him, a subtle distance that he couldn't quite mask. He had always been a man of action, a man who liked to fix things, to make sense of the chaos. But now, faced with the uncertainty of his future, his very sense of self, he had become quieter, more introspective, and Maya could sense the battle raging within him. Maya Jack's voice interrupted her thoughts, soft but carrying the weight of something deeper. "Can we talk?" She turned, finding him standing in the doorway of the living room, his posture still tense, but the exhaustion in his eyes unmistakable. It wasn't just physical exhaustion. It was the kind of weariness that came from facing something you couldn't control, something that had slipped through your fingers and left you with nothing but the fragments of what was. "Of course," Maya replied, her voice steady but warm. She crossed the room toward him, her heart swelling with a quiet compassion that had taken root in her chest over the past few months. She knew this wasn't easy for him. None of this was. Jack stepped aside to let her sit on the couch next to him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was comfortable but heavy with the unspoken words they had yet to share. "I've been thinking," Jack said finally, his voice low and hesitant, "about what the doctor said about everything we've been through. And I've realized something. Something I didn't want to admit to myself." Maya turned to face him, her hand resting gently on his. "What is it?" "I've been holding on to the past," Jack confessed, his voice rough with the weight of the admission, "to the life we had before the accident. I've been trying to remember it, trying to piece it together like it's something I can just fix. But the truth is I can't, and I don't think I should anymore." Maya's heart stilled in her chest. She had known that Jack was struggling, but hearing him say the words out loud, the admission that he was ready to let go of the past, struck her in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't just about memory. It was about accepting what they had lost and finding the courage to move forward without the illusion of returning to what was. "I don't want to let go." Jack continued, his voice softer, now the rawness of his vulnerability filling the room. "But I can't keep living in the shadow of what's gone. I need to be present for you, for Zoe, for myself. I need to stop trying to be the man I was and start being the man I am now." Maya's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of relief that Jack was finally ready to let go of the burden that had been weighing him down. The burden of trying to return to a past that was no longer possible. It was a painful decision, one she had known he had to make, but hearing him speak it out loud made it real, made it final. She reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly as she leaned in to kiss him, her lips brushing against his gently. "Jack, you've already come so far," she whispered, "and you're not alone. We're doing this together, okay?" Jack nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a look that was both vulnerable and resolute. Together, he repeated the word, a promise, a commitment to the future they were now building. The next few weeks were a blur of small victories and quiet moments, each one carrying the weight of the decision they had made. Jack was learning to accept that the life they had before was no longer something he could return to. He was finding his way into a new version of himself, a version that didn't rely on the memories of the past to define who he was or what he could offer. He was learning to live in the present, to be the father, the husband, the man he was now, without the burden of comparison to the man he had once been. Maya, too, was learning to let go. She had spent so much of her time clinging to the hope that Jack would remember everything, that he would somehow return to her as the man he had been. But in letting go of that hope, letting go of the need for things to be as they once were, she found something deeper. She found a love that didn't rely on the past, a love that was built on the foundation of who they were now. They spent their evenings in the quiet rhythm of family life. Jack playing with Zoe on the floor, Maya sitting nearby, the weight of their shared history, no longer a burden, but a part of the love they had grown into. They had learned to create new memories, small ones, fleeting moments of connection that would one day form the fabric of the life they were weaving together. One evening, as the sky outside darkened and the stars began to twinkle in the heavens above, Jack and Maya sat on the porch. Zoe asleep in her crib, the quiet hum of the world around them filling the space between them. "I think I'm finally starting to see it," Jack said quietly, his voice filled with a sense of peace that Maya hadn't heard in months. "I'm not the man I was before, and that's okay. I'm here with you, and that's what matters." Maya smiled, her heart full, as she reached for his hand, their fingers interlacing in the cool night air. "That's all I've ever needed," she whispered. You here with me? That's enough. And for the first time since the accident, Maya felt a quiet certainty settle over her. Letting go of the past hadn't been easy, but it had been the key to unlocking the future. They would build together, not as they had been, but as they were now. Stronger, more resilient, more present. Together always. The evening air was warm and soft, carrying the delicate scent of blooming jasmine from the garden outside. Maya stood at the window, her hands resting lightly on the sill as she gazed out over the quiet street. The world seemed to pause for a moment, as though holding its breath in anticipation of something beautiful that was about to unfold. It had been a long journey, a journey filled with more uncertainty, pain, and joy than she had ever imagined. But as she stood there with the glow of the setting sun painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, she knew in her heart that everything had led them to this moment. Jack was beside her, his presence a constant comfort. They had come so far, he rediscovering himself and she learning to love him again, not as the man he once was, but as the man he was now. They had let go of the past and embraced the present. Together they had built a life filled with new memories, new dreams. And in the soft, still evening, the weight of their shared history, of their struggles and triumphs, settled around them like a warm embrace. I never imagined we'd get here, Maya whispered, her voice thick with emotion, though the words were spoken as much to herself as to Jack. Jack turned toward her, his eyes soft with understanding. He knew exactly what she meant. In the early days after the accident, when every moment felt like a battle to reclaim what had been lost, it had been impossible to see beyond the uncertainty. The future had seemed so fragile, so distant. But now as he looked at Maya, he saw a love that had been tested and had emerged stronger. He saw a woman who had never given up on him, even when the road ahead seemed impossible to navigate. We didn't just get here, Maya, Jack said, his voice low and steady. We made it here. Together. Maya turned toward him, her heart swelling with the simple truth of his words. It wasn't just time that had healed them. It was their shared commitment, their love for each other, and the quiet strength that had grown between them. They had fought for this, fought for the love they shared, fought for the family they were rebuilding, fought for a future that was theirs no matter what the past had taken from them. He reached for her hand, his fingers entwining with hers, and in that simple touch, Maya felt the weight of everything they had been through, and the promise of everything they had yet to face. They had lost so much, but in their loss, they had found something even more precious: each other. I love you, Jack, whispered, his voice filled with a tenderness that made Maya's heart flutter. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything he had never been able to say before. They carried the promise of forever. Maya smiled, her lips trembling, as she turned to him fully. She had said those words so many times, but tonight they felt different, deeper, more meaningful than they ever had before. I love you, Jack, forever. He pulled her closer, and for a long moment they stood in the quiet of the room, the weight of their love filling the space between them. They didn't need to say anything more. Their hearts spoke the words that their mouths could never quite capture. They had found each other again in a way that was deeper than memory, deeper than the past. They had found each other in the present, in the quiet moments, in the shared glances and the tender touch that spoke of everything they had been through and everything they had become. The sound of Zoe's laughter floated in from the next room, a sweet reminder of the family they had built. Jack looked toward the door, his eyes softening as he heard her giggle, and Maya knew exactly what he was thinking. Their daughter, their beautiful, bright-eyed daughter, was the symbol of everything they had fought for, everything they had hoped for. She was the proof that despite the brokenness of the past, they had created something beautiful, something lasting. We've come so far, Jack said quietly, his gaze on the door now, where Zoe's tiny feet could be heard pattering across the floor. And we have so much more to look forward to. Maya nodded, her hand gently brushing the side of his face, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw with a tenderness that was born of years of shared love, shared life. I know. The best part is still ahead of us. They both knew that the road ahead would not always be easy. There would still be challenges, still moments when the past threatened to resurface, but they also knew that they were no longer bound by it. They had let go of the need to return to what had been, and in doing so, they had created something even more beautiful, something that was uniquely theirs. Forever remembered, Maya whispered, as if the words themselves were a vow. Forever loved. Jack smiled a smile that reached his eyes as if they were a promise all on their own. Yes, forever. And nothing will ever change that. In the quiet of their home, surrounded by the love they had built, Maya felt something deep within her shift. They had come through so much pain, so much uncertainty, but they had come through it together. They had found their way back to each other, to the love they had shared, and in doing so had created a life that was more beautiful than anything they could have ever imagined. And as Jack held her close, as Zoe's laughter echoed through the walls, Maya knew that this was only the beginning of the rest of their lives. A new chapter written in the language of love, trust, and resilience. They had let go of the past, but in doing so, they had built something that would last forever. Their love, their family, their future. Together, always. As the evening deepened, the promise of forever hung in the air. It was not just a story of overcoming obstacles or fighting for love. It was the story of two souls finding their way back to each other, of a family bound by more than just memories. If you felt the power of love, the beauty of rediscovery, and the strength of commitment, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Let them know that even in the darkest times, love can guide the way. Like, comment, and follow for more stories of hope, resilience, and the power of love. Let's walk this journey together.